certainly welcome to. Just come on up, and the sign-up sheet's right up here. And so, now, let's continue. Where we left off last week was with the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, Pastor had to go and steal all my thunder with his sermon today. Well, not all of it, but you really should have run that by me first, because a lot of what we're going to start out talking about is what was in the sermon. Oh, really good sermon, too. So some of the information you just heard. Now, if you didn't pay attention during the sermon, well, this is your second shot at it here. So, we can make it happen. Now, what we're going to start out talking about is the burial of Jesus. So after the crucifixion, Pilate only appears one more time in the Gospels. But there are things of interest to note about Pontius Pilate at this time. And after Jesus had died, Joseph of Arimathea came to Pilate, and he requested the body of Jesus for burial. Now, this was a bold move by Joseph, as this was basically signifying that he was openly with Jesus and his followers now. And that was a dangerous thing at this time. You think about it, the disciples were scattered at the crucifixion, and they were all in hiding right now. So the fact that Joseph of Arimathea had the courage to go to Pilate and ask for his body is basically a public statement saying that I am a follower of Jesus. Now, you can tell why now? Why at this point? Well, just a few hours before this, at the Jewish trials of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea would have been there. And he would have said absolutely nothing in defense of Jesus. And that obviously weighed very much on his conscience. So he goes to Pilate. Now, when he asked Pilate for the body of Jesus, Pilate gave it to him. But it must have confused Pilate a little bit, because the Jewish Sanhedrin had just sent him a prisoner. And they were very adamant about this whole scene that they wanted this guy killed. And then a couple hours later, here comes another member of the Sanhedrin to request the body so that he can bury it properly. Now, in the Gospel of John, it tells us that Nicodemus was there with him. And they took Jesus' body down off the cross, and they placed it in Joseph's own tomb. Now, this sort of treatment for the body of an executed criminal is very unusual. Most of the time, the body of an executed criminal would just be thrown into a pauper's grave, or even just discarded in the Hinnom Valley and left to decay. So this was an unusual request. Joseph and Nicodemus used 75 pounds of spices and aloes in Jesus' burial. And this is an extravagant amount. I mean, just think about this. A few months before, Mary, the sister of Lazarus, had poured some perfume on Jesus' feet. And just a little bit of that perfume cost a year's wages. Well, 75 pounds of spices and aloes is usually something that's only reserved for royalty. And in this case, it was reserved for royalty again. But as Luke tells us, Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead when Joseph came and asked him for the body. And why? Why would he be surprised by this? Well, people don't normally die from crucifixion after only 3 hours. Usually it takes days for people to suffocate under crucifixion. But here, Jesus only spent about 3 hours on the cross. So, what would Pilate have done upon this? Well, he questioned the centurion in charge of crucifying Jesus. And after talking to him, Pilate was satisfied that, yes, Jesus was, in fact, dead. Now, we're going to talk more about this in just a moment, but there were strange things that were happening. Another strange thing that happened at that time was this darkness that came over the land while Jesus was on the cross. Now, this darkness was not just a local event. From other sources outside of the Bible, we find out that this unnatural darkness actually was a global event. It was commented on in Greece, in Italy, and even all the way in Egypt as well. And all of that can be traced back to April 3rd, 33 AD. Now, all four of the Gospels comment on the fact about the tomb of Jesus. Now, in John, it tells us that the tomb was right there, right by where Jesus was crucified. So if any of you take a trip to Jerusalem, there's multiple places you can go to see the tomb of Jesus. Two of the most popular ones, the one is the Garden Tomb, which is not far away from the crucifixion place. And it is what it sounds like. It's a tomb in the middle of a garden. And then there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So this kind of leads into another Bible study I do, but Constantine, the Emperor Constantine's mother, went to the Holy Land way back in about 325 AD. And she started to figure out where all these famous things happened in the Holy Land in Jesus' life. And one of the places she found was the Church of the Nativity, where Jesus was apparently born. And another one is where Jesus died on Golgotha and was buried in the tomb. Then Constantine built a church right there. And on one end of the church is where Golgotha was. And then on the other end of the church is where the tomb is. So you can see these were really close to each other, if that is the actual location. We have to kind of wonder if it is, because John tells us it's right there, but we don't know if it was that close enough to be able to be held in one particular church. But all four of the Gospels also comment that Joseph of Arimathea used a brand new tomb, and that tomb was cut out of rock. So let's see how Luke recorded it. In Luke 23:53, says, then he's talking about Joseph of Arimathea, took it, which is Jesus' body, took it down and wrapped it in linen cloth and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one which no one had yet been laid. Now, anytime you have all four of the Gospels talking about one thing, well, that thing tends to be pretty important. So why were they going out of their way to note that the tomb was A, cut out of rock, and two, that it had never been used before? Why would it be so important? Well, because that information refutes a lot of the different theories that are out there about what happened that Easter morning when Jesus was resurrected. And it also refutes the theories that run contrary to God's word. And we're going to look at three of those theories that are out there about what happened on the resurrection. We're going to compare them to God's word, and we're going to see what happens. So the very first one that's out there, this is a popular theory. It's known as the swoon theory. Now, what this theory states is that Jesus spent so little time on the cross, only about 3 hours, that he didn't actually die. He just lost consciousness, and that resembled death. And then he was wrapped in linens. He was put into the tomb, and the cool of the rock helped to revive him. And then he was able to get up and roll the stone away and appear to resurrect himself. Now, we can pretty much easily refute this theory and show that it's wrong. How we can do it is we can look into Scripture and see, well, what did the execution squad do when Jesus was on the cross and had been reported as being dead? Excuse me. Excuse me. Now, the Roman execution squad actually verified the fact that Jesus was dead, and they did it in a very Roman way, which is brutal and efficient. Does anyone remember how did they verify that Jesus was actually dead? I heard somebody say it. They took a spear, and what did they do with the spear? Yeah, they stuck it into his side, right? So when you do that, when you actually stick a spear into somebody like that, it depends on where the spear hits. And we can tell from the description where the spear hit Jesus. So when it went into Jesus, it actually pierced the pericardium, which is the sac that surrounds the heart. And out of the hole, that flowed blood and water. So what does that tell us, blood and water? Well, a couple of things, actually. First is you don't survive a spear thrust to the heart. That is universally fatal. And second, it tells us that Jesus' blood had actually started to separate into blood and plasma, when plasma is mostly water. And that separation of blood and plasma doesn't happen until after death. So we can tell that Jesus was dead at that time. Now, how did Jesus actually physically die? Probably his heart stopped under intense agony. That would have accelerated the separation of blood and water as well. So we can confirm through the Bible that Jesus actually did die on the cross. He didn't just swoon or fall unconscious. He actually died and then was risen again. Now, another one that's out there is something called the mistaken identity theory. So this is the theory that somebody else was buried in the tomb and they were resurrected instead of Jesus. Now, that sounds a little bit strange, but it's common in tombs in Jerusalem to be used again and again. As a matter of fact, you've been with me for 5 weeks, so if you come back next week, we're going to talk about something called ossuaries, right? And one of the things that we're going to talk about is how Jews used tombs over and over again. Well, a lot of people started thinking, well, maybe it was somebody else from that tomb. But, however, remember what Luke said. He said that tomb was cut into rock and no one had yet been laid in it. So if it was a new tomb and nobody had ever used it before, well, then it's pretty easy to refute the mistaken identity theory because there was nobody else buried there to be mistaken for. So it was definitely Jesus. Now, the third one is the one that is the oldest theory. And this one takes a little bit more time and effort to refute. It's known as the stolen body theory. So this is the most popular one, and it's still around today. The theory is that the disciples, after the crucifixion, they regained their courage, and they stole the body of Jesus from the tomb, and then proclaimed he was resurrected, just as Jesus promised he would be. Now, since the guards on the tomb were Roman, that means the official position of Rome would be that Jesus did not rise from the dead. Now, the Jewish officials in their government, the Sanhedrin, had already proclaimed that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. So therefore, both Jewish and Roman governments say that this is the case. And that's why the stolen body theory is still around. But how could the disciples have done it? How could they have gotten the body out? You can't tunnel into it because Luke tells us that the tomb was made out of rock. And there isn't enough time to cut through rock to get the body out. Not only that, but with first century tools, if you want to cut through rock, it's going to be loud. Everybody in the vicinity would be able to know that that's what you're up to. So you can't tunnel into the tomb to get the body. So how else would the disciples have gotten it? Well, there's a big stone in front of it. What if they rolled the stone away and took the body out? But there's a problem with that too. And the problem with it is that the Jews had taken precautions that the disciples precisely couldn't do this. So we have to take a close look at what's in Matthew to refute this stolen body theory. However, because there's different ways to see what is written in Matthew, this is why the theory is still around today. So let's take a look at Matthew. Now, this is the NIV translation of Matthew. Now, I grew up mostly with the King James, but I was in grade school when we switched to the NIV. So this is the one that, I gotta be honest, most of us know the best. So let's read what Matthew had to say in chapter 27, it's verse 62 to 66. It says, the next day, so they're talking about Saturday, the day after Good Friday. The one after preparation day, that's preparing for the Sabbath. So we're talking about Saturday here. The next day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we can remember that while he was still alive, the deceiver, they're talking about Jesus, said that after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. And this last deception will be worse than the first one. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go and make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. Now, there are two major questions that arise from Matthew here. First, is notice the quotation that says the next day. So we're talking about Saturday. Well, that means if they didn't get to Pilate before Saturday, that the body of Jesus sat in the tomb unguarded all of the night of Good Friday. So why wouldn't they then say that the body was stolen on Good Friday evening? And second, take a look at Pilate's word here. He says, take a guard, right? Now that suggests that Roman soldiers were guarding the tomb. But did Rome really put a guard on Jesus' tomb? Well, let's look at both of them. Both the idea that the Roman soldiers were guarding the tomb, and let's look at that night of Good Friday as well. Because it's always seemed strange to me that the Jews fabricated the lie that the disciples stole the body while the guards were sleeping. Because why bother with that lie when they have several hours unaccounted for on Good Friday evening where the disciples could have gone in and got the body and taken out? So that leads to an important question. When the Jews posted the guard around Jesus' tomb, did they check to make sure that the body of Jesus was actually there inside? Well, I got to believe that yes. Yes, they did, almost certainly check to make sure that there was something in the tomb before they put a seal on it and stood guard outside of it. Because it would be incredibly stupid to actually post a guard without checking to make sure that the thing you're guarding is actually there. So they had to check to make sure that Jesus' body was still there. Then they posted the guard. And the chief priests said many things, but stupid isn't one of them. So of course they would check. But also we have to take into account that they didn't use this excuse. They didn't use the excuse that the body was taken on Good Friday. And the only reason they wouldn't use it is because they know that the body was there, because they checked when they posted the guard. So it's kind of inductive logic reason, but it's very, very reasonable that Jesus' body was there on Saturday when they posted the guard. Now, was that guard Jewish or was it Roman? Now, this simple question has been argued about for centuries. Now, if you take a quick look at Matthew, it leads to the conclusion that the guard was Roman. Because after all, it states that Pilate said, take a guard. However, that translation is a little bit open to question. Not a little bit, a lot of it. So the Greek for this can be translated two ways. It can be correctly translated as have a guard. Okay. Now, this is the translation favored by the NIV. This is what we just wrote. Now, the NIV chose the word take instead of have a guard, but it means the same thing, right? Now, it can also be correctly translated as you have a. Well, this is completely different. The whole meaning of everything completely changes if you use this translation. So if they said, hey, can we have a guard? And Pilate said, you have a guard. Use it and go secure the tomb. Well, that's a completely different meaning. He's telling the Jews to do it himself. Now, this translation of you have a guard, by the way, is also the one that you find in the King James Bible. It's also the one that you find in the EHV Bible as well. But they make a big difference. So, which one is correct? Well, in my very humble opinion, the second one has to be correct. Because if you take all of the events that have been leading up to this, especially the relationship between Pilate and the Jews, they had not been getting along for 7 years at this point. Pilate had just the day before this opened up a trial and tried Jesus in a Roman trial when the Jews handed him over to be executed. They were not getting along at all. In fact, they had come to him and asked him to change the titulus above the cross, and Pilate famously answered, what I have written, I have written. In other words, get out, right? And all of a sudden, now here they are asking him to basically hound Jesus after he was dead. So no, it's much more likely that Pilate told them, you have a guard of your own. Go take care of the matter yourself. Now, the real clincher for this argument is what did the guards do after the events of Easter morning? So who did the guards report to? So we look at Matthew 28, and it says, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. Well, there is absolutely no way that a Roman soldier would report to the chief priests instead of their own centurion. So these would have been Syrian or Italian soldiers if the guard were Roman, and they had little love for the Jews. And then the actions of the Sanhedrin kind of reinforced this premise in the next verses. Matthew goes on to say, when the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets back to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. So if you look closely at this, you can see these guards must have been Jewish, probably from the temple guards. There is absolutely no way the Sanhedrin could satisfy Pilate or keep them out of trouble if they were really Roman soldiers. Now, all the times that the Jews had triumphed over Pilate, they had done so because Pilate had interfered in a religious matter. Well, this is not a religious matter. Right? These would have been professional soldiers given an order by the prefect of Rome. They're not going to report to the chief priest. Now, if those were truly Roman guards, the Jews would have no influence over Pilate handling of them. As a matter of fact, Pilate would have loved to have the Jews try to interfere at that point with his soldiers, because that would have been considered an act of rebellion. There's no way that they could hide behind Tiberius or send a letter excusing themselves. No. Now they're interfering in the Roman army. And I have to say that Pilate was bound to find out about the resurrection of Jesus. This wasn't like 10 or 15 people knew about this. The whole city, the whole country knew about this. And that news would have gotten to Pilate as well. And what would Pilate have done if those were Roman soldiers? The first thing he would have done is brought those Roman soldiers in front of him and said, what happened? Now, if the soldiers had looked at Pilate and said, well, you see, the disciples came while we were asleep on duty. Does anyone know the Roman punishment for being asleep on duty? Instant death, right? And not only asleep on duty, but then telling them, oh, well, we also took money from the Jews and we lied to our centurion. No, that's not going to happen, right? But what if the guard was Jewish? What if it came from the temple guard? Would Rome really care that Jewish guard had fallen asleep and that the disciples had come in and stolen the body? No, not really. It wasn't Roman soldiers that fell asleep. It was Jewish soldiers that fell asleep. And not only that, but what had really been stolen? Just the body of an executed criminal. So it's pretty obvious that the guards were Jews, not Romans. And I know in our first verse of our last hymn today in church, we sang that it was Pilate's guard. No, they would have been guards of the Jewish temple. Sorry about that. Spoiler alert for any of you singing the hymn at the next service. But so, why do we harp on this? Because we use all of this to easily refute the stolen body theory. None of it matches up to what is actually in history. So therefore, we can treat the stolen body theory as simply what the Bible says. It's a lie. Now, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to start to bring this to a conclusion. Let's talk about Pilate after Jesus. So Pilate was prefect of Judea for 3 more years after Jesus was crucified. And it's rather ironic that what brings his prefecture to a close is not the Jews. Even though that's who he's had problems with his entire career, what brings his prefecture to a close is a problem that he has with the almost forgotten Samaritans. Now let's talk about the Samaritans for just a little bit. So who were they? Well, after King Solomon, the kingdom split in 2 after Solomon. There was a northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Now, eventually the northern kingdom would get taken over and captured by the Assyrians. And the Assyrians grabbed almost everybody and took them back to Assyria. Now, those ones that were left would then marry the local people, and you can tell that the Jewish religion was then changed for those people that were left. Now, the lower kingdom would last for another 136 years after the northern kingdom was taken. And the southern kingdom was then captured by Babylon, who took them back to Babylon, but only kept them for 40 years and then sent them back. So the Jewish traditions remained alive in the southern kingdom. In the north, they did not. So a lot of the characters in the Samaritan religion are the same people that are in the Jewish religion, except for the difference, right? So for example, one of the largest differences between the Samaritans and the Jews is that they believed things like the mountain of Gerizim. So the mountain of Gerizim is in Samaria, and then you see a picture of it. And they believed that this was a holy mountain. They believed that Moses placed on Mount Gerizim the Ark of the Covenant and other sacred vessels. They also believed this mountain was the only mountain in the world that didn't get covered by the flood. Now, the Jews knew this was completely foolish because, well, Moses never made it past the Jordan River. So how on earth could he have come to Mount Gerizim to put the Ark of the Covenant there? And not only that, but Mount Gerizim is a lot shorter than Mount Ararat. So how could it have remained uncovered by the flood? So you can see that the two don't get along very well because of the differences in between their religions. They're considered more cousins than brothers, which is why Jesus used one of the Samaritans as, his example for the Good Samaritan. Now, in the year 36 AD, so this is 3 years after the crucifixion, there was a man in Samaria who started to gather people together. And he had them really whipped up into a religious fervor. And we're going to finally go back to Josephus here and see what Josephus has to say about him. He says, the man who excited them to it, the Samaritans is what he's talking about, was one who thought lying a thing of little consequence, and who contrived everything so, that the multitude might be pleased. So he bade them to get together upon Mount Gerizim, which by them is looked upon as the most holy of all mountains. And he assured them that when they come thither, he would show them those sacred vessels which were laid under that place because Moses put them there. So what he basically, Josephus is telling us is that this man, this liar who was pretty much an insurrectionist, was gathering a very large crowd, and he put them on the road right underneath Mount Gerizim. Now, this was not a harmless religious pilgrimage, as Josephus tells us that all these people had weapons with them, swords and axes and tools, right? Now, having a large group of people with weapons sitting on one of your major roads through your province, Pilate would come only to one conclusion about this. This is a rebellion. So Pilate gathers his troops. He takes them out of Caesarea. He takes them to Samaria, and there is a pitched battle right on the road, right below Mount Gerizim. Yeah. On one side, you have a whole bunch of people who are in a religious fervor, and on the other, you have professional soldiers of Rome. I think you know how this is going to go. So the Roman army scattered all of the people. They captured the leaders, and Pilate held summary executions right on the battlefield. And then he declared victory, gathered up his army, and went back to Caesarea. But the Samaritans weren't done just yet. So they immediately sent an embassy to Vitellius. Now, Vitellius is the Roman legate in Syria. This is Pilate's boss. And the Samaritans claimed that they had gathered on that road not in order to revolt, but they gathered there to escape Pilate's violence. Well, you notice how the claim has changed. At first, they had gathered to go up to Mount Gerizim and find the Ark of the Covenant. And now, no, we weren't doing that. We were gathering because Pilate is so violent. Now, Vitellius, Pilate's boss, must have been warned by Tiberius to keep an eye on this Pontius Pilate down in right below him, right? Because what Vitellius does is he immediately relieves Pilate of his prefecture. He doesn't even bother to ask him about it or send a letter or look into it. He just says immediately, Pilate, you are ordered back to Rome. So that means Pilate's going to be put on trial. Now, what do you think Pilate's odds of surviving that trial would be? Basically nothing. No chance. Now, I'm sure Pilate was pretty exasperated by the unannounced arrival of his replacement. And it was done in such an offhand manner by Vitellius that he is dispatched back to Rome. And he had to be going, but why? You know, all the actions of all the actions that Pilate did as prefect of Judea, dispelling a rebellion in his own province seems to be one of the most reasonable actions that he took. And the irony of having to return to Rome in disgrace and possibly facing execution himself, even though he was innocent, that would have given him a good appreciation of what Jesus felt like when he was standing before Pilate and being executed, even though he was innocent. Now, there's a general rule that in Rome, for all of their prefects and governors, that when your prefecture ends, you have 3 months to get from your province back to Rome and report in. But this is an unusual time because it's winter right now. So the Mediterranean Sea is closed. Pilate cannot take a boat back to Rome. He's got to go over land. Now, this had to be a lonely journey for Pilate and Procula, right? Because he's got to be thinking, okay, I'm going to face a trial when I get back. Are they just going to talk about this Samaritan incident? Or are they going to bring back all of the things, all the problems that I had? The Standards affair, the Shields affair, the execution of Jesus. Are they going to bring all of this back up? And most importantly, will they bring up the fact that I was appointed and was a friend of Sir James? So this had to be going through his mind as he goes back to face his accuser. But just as Pilate is about to enter Rome, Tiberius suddenly died. Now, this must have been a huge relief for Pilate, because his chance of living through a trial was slim to none. But with a new emperor, all past indiscretions would be wiped clean. So, who is the new emperor? Well, the new emperor is the nephew of Tiberius. His name was Gaius. However, history remembers him by his nickname that he had as a child. The new emperor is Caligula. Now, show of hands, who's heard of Caligula before? This guy was crazy. And we'll get a little bit into him next week and what he got up to. But Caligula basically did a 4-year reign of terror. He elected his horse to the Senate. Which, now that I think about it, I've seen our senator. No, that isn't good. You know, Caligula was a madman, but we'll get a little bit more into him next week. But Pilate's trial was not going to happen now. So what happened to Pontius Pilate? Well, the truth is we don't know. No more is recorded in history about Pilate from a credible source. Josephus doesn't tell us anymore, and there's no other histories that are accurate where we can figure out what happened to him. Now, many myths and legends about Pilate and Procula have developed, especially during the Middle Ages. No less than 4 countries claim that Pilate was born in their country. Now, some early Christian church tradition claims that Pilate and Procula both became Christian. Other myths are that Pilate was exiled by Caligula and died a few years later in Gaul. Now, in the 6th century, the Eastern Orthodox Church in Ethiopia recognized Pilate and Procula as saints, and they dedicated a special church day to them. Now, in the Middle Ages, it was very popular, very in vogue, to come up with new and gruesome ways for Pilate. Now, I'm quite sure that Pilate never really understood that he would become the most famous Roman that ever lived. As a matter of fact, we say his name in church almost every single Sunday, and have for 2,000 years. So, upon hearing all about Pilate and his experiences, it's important that we ask ourselves 3 questions. Question number 1 is, was Pilate a good man? And you know what? This is supposed to be discussion. And I know I've dominated the conversation, so maybe I should ask, what do you guys think about Pontius Pilate? You've now heard about him for 5 weeks. You've heard a bunch of Roman history that hardly anybody knows about, but now you do. Was Pilate a good man? What do you guys think? Yeah.
A good man, but also a sinner.
Oh, definitely a sin. And we go back to Jesus did not absolve Pilate of the sin of handing him over to be crucified, right? Now, he said the Jews' sin was greater, but that doesn't mean that Pilate didn't sin. But my own view of Pilate was that he was a very clever man. He always had a fallback position, but he was not a very brave man. Clever, but not. All right, well, how about this one? What would you have done different than Pontius Pilate? What do you think? You've heard all about him and all the things that he did in his 10 years as prefect. What would you have done? I know I'm asking the deep, tough questions. This is what my students do to me too. They're like, oh man, what if I get it wrong? And it's okay, but does anyone like to chime in on that? What would you have done? Yeah?
Can't really do nothing any different.
I would agree. That was God's plan there. But if you had the choice, if you had the option, what would you have done different?
He put himself in a spot where really you'd have to go way back, to really go.
Yeah. And he put himself in a position with the Jews that was almost impossible. If you're governing a people and they have a trump card to play against you and change anything that you're doing, you're struggling as a governor. I don't know how you can govern effectively with that. So I agree. He needed to change what he was doing way before Jesus ever got to him. I would agree with that. Yeah, ask me. Yeah, his relationship with Sejanus was interesting. Did Pilate know about the treachery of Sejanus? We don't know. We don't know where actually if Pilate knew what Sejanus was up to. And if you remember, Sejanus killed the son of Tiberius, trying to become co-emperor, right? Did Pilate know about that? I don't know if he did or if he didn't. I would say the evidence probably was pretty murky back then too, as Tiberius let him reign for, 5 more years after Sejanus died? Was it the right person to hang out with? I don't know. How about this last question here? How should we view Pilate today? Do we view him as a necessary tool of God? Do we view him as a bad man who did something he shouldn't do? Do we hear his name every single Sunday? How should we view him? I would agree. God was in control the entire time and had the plan and knew how Pilate would react to that plan. But do we cringe when we hear his name? Do we get angry that he's the one that was responsible for handing Jesus over to the execution squad? How do we view him? I know these are difficult questions. That's why I chose them, by the way, because I want you guys to think about it. And now when you hear his name during the creeds and things like that, you know a lot more about this Roman man named Pontius. Yeah. This brings us to the end of the story for Pontius Pilate, because we don't know any more about it. And you're asking yourself, wait a minute, what are we going to do next week? Well, next week's going to be fun, guys. We're going to do something that's called the items of interest section for this. And we're going to look at a lot of archaeological evidence. Some of the people that play a part in this, we're going to find out what happened to them. People like Vitellius, who dismissed high-handedly Pilate. We're going to figure out what happened to him. There's all kinds of interesting little things throughout history that we have to talk about. And it's usually everyone's favorite part of the presentation. There's a lot of cool stuff in it. But we're no longer going to be following the story of Pontius Pilate. So that gives me the opportunity to say, do you have any questions about any of the 5 weeks? It seems like more than 5 weeks we've been talking about this, but are there any questions? In that case, that's all for this week, folks. And I hope to see you next week.